Bioventix has reported operating margins over 70% every year since 2015. To put that in context, for me personally, I'd usually look at anything over 20% as being a very high margin. So this business is really just off the scale in terms of its profitability.
It's fantastic, isn't it?
It is. And I think it's probably worth us explaining why, because there's kind of two sides to this.
Welcome to the Private Investors Podcast, the podcast where key stock pickers Roland Head and Maynard Paton talk about managing their share portfolios. Roland writes about his dividend stocks at rolandhead.com, while I write about my small caps at maynardpaton.com. This time we cover Bioventix and the investment potential of diagnostic antibodies. Let's get started.
So Maynard, I've read your 22 portfolio report and I can see that Bioventix is now your largest shareholding.
Well, it's 12% of my portfolio now. It was my 7th largest holding a year ago, and now it's my largest position. The company had good results last year and the shares went up while everything else in my portfolio went down. So it's now my largest position and I'm a bit more keen to talk about it.
You went to the recent AGM as well. Did you pick up any additional information there that shareholders might not have got from October's results?
Yes, I did. It was my first Bioventix AGM. There were 5 shareholders present, which is a lot for a small cap AGM. Good Q&A session, 45 minutes long with the directors and lots of information given out during that time that we can talk about during this podcast.
So how long have you owned Bioventix shares now?
I bought in 2016, so I paid just over £11. Never sold any of these shares. The shares are now £40, so the market cap is just over 200 million. And I've collected some great dividends, £7 a share over the 6 or 7 years I've held these shares. Factoring the dividends as well, I've more than quadrupled my money in 6 to 7 years, which is a great result. I'm really pleased with the performance of the company and its wonderful share price performance. Yeah. And what about you? Because you own these shares as well. So when did you buy?
Yeah, I do hold them as well, but I haven't held them for as long as you, unfortunately. I started buying the shares in 2021 at around £36. It certainly isn't the cheapest share that I've bought in recent times, but I was attracted by Bioventix's very long record of growth and dividend payments. And I suppose the evidence the way I see it, that the company's antibody business must be something a little bit special to have generated these results for so long. I suppose after the events of the last few years, we've all heard the term antibodies, but perhaps you could explain a bit more about how Bioventix develops and sells these antibodies and why they're so valuable.
I'll do my best. I'm not an expert at antibodies, but they are part of your immune system. So they are proteins created by your blood cells, your white blood cells, that protect you from viruses and bacteria to keep you healthy. So they latch onto the virus or bind onto the virus to counteract the infection. So they're created naturally by your autoimmune system, but they can also be created through vaccines. So if you've had the COVID-19 vaccine, that creates antibodies in your system that bind onto the virus to counteract the infection. So it's this binding process where the antibody binds onto what's called the antigen. This binding process, that is the basis for a blood test or blood test diagnostics in a hospital. So Bioventix and other companies, they develop antibodies for blood tests. So it will design an antibody that binds onto a particular molecule or element in your blood. So for Bioventix, its best-selling antibody binds onto vitamin D. So if you see a doctor with a problem, the doctor may say that's because you've got low levels of vitamin D. So you go for a blood test, your blood is taken, put into a blood test machine, and it's mixed in with Bioventix's antibody. And the machine gives out a result that tells the doctor what your level of vitamin D is. And then the doctor can then tell whether that's a problem or not. So Bioventix, it's developed a small range of blood test antibodies. So there's about 20. So there's vitamin D. There's also antibodies that test for thyroid hormones, various fertility hormones, the presence of certain drugs such as cannabis, something called biotin, which, to be honest, Roland, I don't really know what biotin is. And there's also a test for troponin, which I do know about troponin. This is a protein that leaks out of the heart when you've had a heart attack. If you're in A&E with chest pains, doctor may take a blood test to check your troponin level, and that can help tell the doctor whether you've had a heart attack or not. So that is a basic layman's explanation of antibodies. and Bioventix's antibodies. But one thing I do know about antibodies is they make a ton of money, and you must have seen this in the financials.
Yeah, you're right. The Bioventix is fantastically profitable. And I think what attracted me really to the business is the combination of this incredible profitability along with a steady record of growth. If we look back at some of the numbers, over the last 10 years, the company's annual sales revenue has risen from 2.7 million to 11.7 million last year. So that's an average growth rate of getting on for 18% a year, which I think is a very strong record over a whole decade. Admittedly, you mentioned that the current market cap is just over 200 million. Sales of 12 million a year don't really seem very much for a company that's valued so highly. But the secret here is that the Bioventix does have these incredible profit margins. Looking at last year, the company reported an operating margin of 79%. So out of 11.7 million of revenue, the end result was nearly 8 million in after-tax profit. It's an incredible performance. I think the only mainstream company I can think of with a similar record is Rightmove, which pretty much has a monopoly on its market. And last year wasn't just a one-off either. Bioventix has reported operating margins over 70% every year since 2015. To put that in context, for me personally, I'd usually look at anything over 20% as being a very high margin. So this business is really just off the scale in terms of its profitability. And I think it's probably worth us explaining why, because there's kind of two sides to this, to the company's income, isn't there?
Yeah, it sells antibodies. It sells it two ways. You can sell the physical antibodies, so they're in a small tube in a clear liquid, or it collects a royalty from them. So most of the money comes in from royalties, which explains the high margins. So the manufacturers of these blood test machines in hospitals, they can make the antibody themselves based on Bioventix's design. And then every time these antibodies are used for a blood test, they will pay a small royalty to Bioventix. I asked at the AGM what the royalty rates are. They said generally it's about 2%. So this explains the high margin, because the costs of developing these antibodies are all written off years ago. There's no ongoing expense. So the royalties just roll in, and there's no other associated cost. So again, I confirmed this at the AGM. The royalties come in, and it's 100% gross margin. Once they paid the royalty, there's no other direct costs taken off this royalty. So the best thing is Bioventix can enjoy growth in volumes of blood tests without having to do anything. It's a hugely scalable, it's a textbook scalable business. So it grows on thin air. The royalties come in from these tests. The antibodies don't need updating or upgrading every year or anything like that. But the volumes of blood tests can increase, and so the royalties keep on increasing as well. So that explains this sort of 79-80% margin they enjoy. It's just the royalties come in and there's no associated costs because the development's all been done years ago.
Yeah, although I suppose it's probably worth saying that even if there were no royalties, this would still be a reasonable business. I estimated that it would still have a profit margin of maybe 30% just from selling physical antibodies. So it's by no means a bad business, even without the royalties, but they really do juice up the results.
Yeah, the physical antibodies about £3 million last year, but the royalties were like 8, something like that. And just the economics, once you get the antibody, the royalties come in. The royalties versus the development costs is just incredible. The ratio, the amount of royalties you get versus the development cost is incredible. So that's where you get these 80% margins. And it only sells just a fraction, 20 grams of antibodies a year? That's
it's 20 grams, and they only employ 16 people, the entire company, including the directors. And yeah, it is incredible, really. But they're able to, as well, that they can actually get the royalties because other people will continue to make the antibodies for them, as it were, or
the manufacturers of blood test machines, they make them, a lot of them, and for certain customers, Bioventix will make the antibodies as well. On the way to the AGM, I had some time to kill, so I went to see their lab on the outskirts of Farnham town centre, and it's on this anonymous industrial estate. You drive in, and there's a sign there listing all the companies on this industrial estate, and Bioventix isn't there on this sign. I thought, am I in the right place? And I was parked outside the lab, and there's no signs on the lab on their office building saying Bioventix, and it's next door to a vehicle accident repair shop. So they've got all these battered cars next door being repaired. There's a carpet shop as you drive in, you pass, and you think this is a £200 million business. If you look at the books, the stock carried, I think, is worth as much as the building they are operating from.
Yeah, I think it's around 500,000 of stock
Yeah.
reported at the end of last year. And I don't know how long they've owned the building, but they probably paid less than that for it, I think.
So 20 milligrams of antibodies in the freezer is worth as much as the building. And if you think what the market value of this stock is worth, I reckon it's probably about the same as the whole industrial estate the company's located on. So it is the economics. You're sitting in the car outside their building, you think it's just £200 million building with £500,000 of stock in a freezer somewhere, and it's worth more than all these other businesses it's next door.
And they don't have to spend very much on equipment or anything like that, at least not on a regular basis anyway. I think over the last couple of years, on average, they've spent about £135,000 a year on physical assets of some sort or another. So I'm guessing that's equipment, computers and what have you for the laboratory, but it's not really a lot of money.
It's not compared to the royalties of 8 million or so, or the revenue of 12. It's just nothing.
It's all a bit strange. It sounds almost like some kind of cottage industry. You've got this very small company operating just from a little backstreet, as it were, and then selling these antibodies to major international medical manufacturers.
Not a cottage.
Antibodies are produced, or is this an exception?
It's not a cottage industry. It looks like it, because the customers are the major manufacturers of blood test machines, which are Roche, Siemens, Abbott, Beckman Coulter. They're the sort of big names, and plus they serve research groups as well. So they would sell, I think, mostly physical antibodies to certain research groups, but the bulk of the money comes from these manufacturers of blood test machines for hospitals. And these manufacturers do have their own R&D departments. So in terms of the machines, other pharmaceutical developments, and also blood test diagnostics. And so it looks like a cottage industry of a little company outside of Farnham Town Centre, but it's a huge industry. And R&D wise for Bioventix, they spend £1 million a year on R&D. And I suspect the likes of Roche spend that in a week. So it's a huge industry.
In terms of producing antibodies, who is Bioventix competing against? These large companies, so they produce their own antibodies.
They can produce their own. So one question was at the AGM, what are the likes of Roche, Siemens up to in terms of developing their own antibodies? Don't know. They don't have any insight. So they supply antibodies to Roche, Siemens, Abbott, but those larger multinationals can be developing their own, and Bioventix doesn't have any sort of insight into what they're doing. So that could be a problem, because at the moment, the vitamin D antibody that I mentioned, that's their biggest seller. And these large companies are paying Bioventix royalties every year, which is growing, or have grown at a pretty decent clip over the years. And you think one day maybe they'll think, these royalties we're paying Bioventix, maybe we should replace their antibody with one of our own, so we stop paying these royalties. So that may be a problem over time, but at the moment, quite happy. It's just one of the things about antibody development is that once you've got an antibody working, it's difficult to dislodge, because there's a lot of time, effort and money involved in research, testing it, getting it approved, and getting it into hospitals for use with the general public. So do you want that time, effort and money spent to dislodge an antibody that's everyone's happy with? Is it worth it? Is it commercially viable to introduce a new antibody? And generally not. This is one of the things I like about antibodies, is that once you've got them working and everybody's happy, that's it. They tend to keep on being used by the industry. One example is, we mentioned at the AGM, we're talking about this biotin product. It was mentioned, it's been on the market since 1999. It's more than 20 years old. And the sales of this product rose more than 60% last year. It's a 20-year-old product, and the sales are up 60%. There's also the test for thyroid. Watching an old presentation on PI World before this podcast, that was introduced in 1995. So that's more than 25 years old, still going, apparently. Vitamin D has been sold since 2012. So that's more than 10 years. The troponin test, that started in 2017, making money for Bioventix. But everything else, I think, is 10 years old plus.
So it sounds like the real opportunity is doing something new and getting it in place, and then you can really sit back and enjoy the rewards. You just need a few winners to keep the ball rolling for a very long time, potentially.
Yeah, you've got an antibody working. Everyone's happy. That seems to be it. It's unlikely you're going to be disrupted as such. There has been occasions, if it's like going back to troponin, this is an example of Bioventix disrupting the troponin test market. So the old test for troponin for a heart attack. So if you presented yourself at A&E, got chest pains, with the old troponin test, the doctor would take the test and you'd have to wait 10, 11, 12 hours before another test just to see if your troponin levels were increasing. So if your troponin levels are increasing, you've had a heart attack. That's the diagnosis. But it takes 10, 11, 12 hours using the old test for it to work. So now with this new test developed by Bioventix, the waiting time is down to 2 to 3 hours. So you go to A&E, you take your test, and you wait 2 or 3 hours, you take another blood test. And because it's a more sensitive test, it detects smaller changes to your troponin levels. So the doctors can say, you've had a small increase in troponin levels. That's not right. You've had a heart attack. So it's a better outcome for the hospital because you've not got people waiting around for 10 hours, and better outcome for the patient because they can get treated sooner if they have had a heart attack. So that's an example of a step change in performance from an antibody whereby there was a need for a better antibody. But generally, those cases are quite rare, I think. And from my understanding is that once it's working in the healthcare industry is quite happy with how it works, and the manufacturers of these blood test machines are quite happy, then these antibodies tend to be used indefinitely. That's from what I can tell.
So it's very much, if it's not broke, no one's going to try and fix it or improve it because there's no real motivation to do so and no demand either, really.
So yeah, it's got to be commercially viable in I think the healthcare industry, perhaps rather than a slightly better vitamin D test, would perhaps prefer the wider R&D around the world in blood tests to be looking at something else rather than a slight improvement in, say, an established test. One thing I did learn about at the AGM regarding hospitals and the blood test manufacturers is Bioventix has no visibility on what the hospitals pay the manufacturers for a test. So they have a 2% royalty, but if the hospitals say, we're not going to pay that much for these tests now, Bioventix will just become a casualty of that because the arrangements between the hospitals and the blood test manufacturers who supply these antibody tests, that's all arranged without Bioventix's involvement. So they are at a whim or at the dependency or at the mercy of what the hospitals decide to pay the manufacturers. So again, I learned at the AGM was the manufacturers enter into 5, 10, 15-year supply agreements with these hospitals. So they're long-term. They supply the machine and what are called the reagent packs, which contain all the antibodies. So any sort of pricing changes may be a gradual effect as these contracts come to the end and are renewed. But there's no visibility into what the hospitals pay the manufacturers of these machines for their blood tests. I did ask that at the AGM. What do the hospitals pay Siemens for these vitamin D tests and these tests? And they said, you've got to ask Siemens that. So they don't have any visibility. They don't have any visibility in the number of antibodies being used. They just get a payment, a royalty payment.
It's a bit of an unusual situation. They really don't know much about what happens to their products, but it doesn't seem to be a big problem. But it does add an element of uncertainty, as you say, over longer time periods, probably more than shorter periods.
Surprising, really, because they sell these antibodies through a royalty. The royalties come in and they get a payment every 6 months. And management said at the AGM, paraphrasing, but we get told of the amount on a Tuesday and get paid on a Wednesday. And that's as much information as they get. So they don't know if the number of tests are increasing or whether the hospitals are paying more. It's just a number. But if those payments start going lower year on year, they may think that could be a risk as they don't really know what's going on. Right at the start of the AGM, I asked them why physical sales of antibodies have declined versus the royalties which are going up. And they said about an alcohol testing antibody. They said sales are down with that. Don't really know why. Don't know, have no insight. So I'm not sure. Yeah, the impression I got from the AGM was they don't have that much insight into who's buying. They know who's buying it, but what for? It's all a bit unclear, and the royalty rate. So any sort of disruption in the market in terms of hospitals paying less or their antibodies being replaced by something else, shareholders of the company may be slow to realize that, I think, and shareholders may be even slower.
Could be very much a lagging. You could lag behind before you realise anything's changed, couldn't it?
Yeah.
I suppose it could be influenced over time by public health policy and clinical recommendations across the whole of the NHS, for the sake of argument, or in another country. But what's considered to be worth testing for, whether it should be tested for more often or less often, and when you look at it across the whole population, that could have a very large effect on the number of tests and the royalties, and perhaps to the funding too for that level of testing. So you can see why it's hard to predict, because it's several levels removed and then magnified potentially over millions of people in a population.
Yeah, there's also been talk about, doctors shouldn't be performing so many vitamin D tests and things like that. But yeah, seems weird, but they are quite removed from what's going on. I asked about this biotin product because sales are up 60%. What's going on there? And they said it wasn't really sure. They knew who the customer was, who's been buying a lot. But somebody asked, what's the end product? And they say, don't know. What's it being used for? Don't know. They said it's being used as a streptavidin lookalike. Streptavidin is another protein similar to biotin. So they thought...
do we know what that's used for?
No, I don't know. No, I don't know what biotin is. Don't ask me about streptavidin either. It's all a bit outside of my knowledge, I'm afraid. But the weird thing is that they said, don't know what it's being used for. We know who's buying it, but can't tell you. And we're not sure about the end product. The sales are up 60%. Peter Harrison, the chief exec, did say there was some good fortune here. So they've had this biotin antibody for more than 20 years, and all of a sudden sales are up 60% this year. I think the sales is knocking on for close to £1 million in this last year of this product, where don't really know what's going on. But there's some good fortune. So it's a bit of luck. But if you get an antibody that works, I think it seems to be working for something else. So some other medical usage. But it is a bit odd that this business makes so much money, and why people are buying is a bit of a mystery sometimes.
Given this level of removal from the end users, I suppose one thing that's reassured me about the business over the years is that they haven't been tempted to over expand or to try and diversify into new areas, because they could easily have afforded to direct cash into projects like that. But instead, they've been very disciplined about staying focused on the core business and letting shareholders benefit from the surplus wealth, haven't they?
Yeah. Talk to me about the special dividends. You're a dividend investor.
Yeah, adding up the dividends since they joined the AIM market in 2014, Bioventix has paid out 872 pence per share. So that's around 45 million. So a couple of things that are quite remarkable about this. First of all, they've managed to increase the dividend by around 25% per year on average over that time, including the special dividends. So for anyone who's bought the shares early and has sat back and collected the payouts, it's been a very good rate of income growth. Even in today with high inflation, your income has still been rising well ahead of inflation. The other thing that's remarkable, I think, is that the dividends paid out so far represent about 160% of the original listing price. I think that was £5.50 in 2014. So even if you bought the shares in 2014, you would have got back in cash £1.60 for every pound you invested without having to sell a single share. Bioventix have been very disciplined about this, and they've continually returned money to shareholders who always have the choice of buying more shares if they would prefer to stay in the business. And I say one thing perhaps is because Peter Harrison, the CEO, is a shareholder, and as a founder, he's still a significant shareholder. So he doesn't want to squander the value that's been created in the business. But I think it's a strong record all the same.
It's fantastic. It's a fantastic record. I think, especially the special dividends every year, whether those special dividends will continue in the current size, I'm not sure, as the ordinary dividend increases. But you just look at the dividend chart, the profit chart, sales chart, they're just fantastic. They're just what textbook charts, financial charts of what a small growing company should be. One thing about the AGM is not everyone's happy.
No, so I've heard. You mentioned there was some people voting against some of the board of directors being
elected. So even though the share price has been fantastic, the dividends have been rolling in, not everyone's happy with the board. So this is at the start of the AGM, the chairman reads out all the votes for the resolutions, and there's protest votes. So there's 20% votes against the two non-execs. There's 5% against Peter Harrison, and a similar number against the finance director as well. So these AGM voting results were not published. The company just said to the market, all the resolutions were carried. Fine. So if you weren't at the AGM, you wouldn't know about these protest votes. So Peter Harrison, at the start, the chief exec, after the votes were were announced, he gave a 10-minute talk, opening remarks. So the first subject he covers is diversity, the modern principles of diversity, because apparently companies been under pressure to apply the principles of diversity from major shareholders. So the board are all male, they're all white, they're all in the 60s, and it's not really a modern day diverse boardroom. But Peter Harrison says the sector is just not that diverse, but they're hoping to improve the situation. So you think, who's voting? The non-execs are really experienced. You look at their CVs in the annual report. They've been in the industry for years, and no doubt they've got all sorts of contacts that can help Bioventix. So they're very experienced. Business has done really well. Look at the dividends rolling in. And you just think, why are some shareholders voting against the management here? It just smacks of a bit of box ticking and too idealistic. So the auditor got 20% protest vote. That was, I think, because of the auditor was changed in the year and they only told shareholders in the annual report. I think these days you've got to tell the market when you've changed your auditor, not tell them a few months later in the small print in the annual report. But I don't know. Peter Harrison, he's got 8%. I think that's probably a key factor in the dividends. I don't have any insight into who the 5% protesting against him. It seems ridiculous, really.
Yeah, as you say, the diversity votes, that doesn't really sound too sinister to me, like possibly a bit of a box-ticking exercise. But I was a bit surprised when you said that Peter Harrison had votes against him, because he seems to have always been an excellent custodian of shareholders' interests, really, from what I can see. I suppose one possibility is that maybe investors are a little concerned about the future and they feel that there's not that many options for future growth, or perhaps that but Bioventix maybe has all its eggs in one or two baskets. When you were at the AGM, did you pick up any other bits of information that might give us a bit more understanding about the future, the pipeline?
Yeah. So before the AGM proper started, I had a quick chat with Peter Harrison. And we talked about biomonitoring. So this is testing to see if you have industrial pollution in your system. He said something along the lines of, it's going to be small, I think. I would not put that on my spreadsheet. That was a little bit disappointed. So this industrial pollution test, it's a urine test, and it tells you whether you have certain industrial pollutants in your system. And Peter Harrison said, well, I think people are quite happy with the existing solution at the moment, which is monitoring tests for similar sort of pollution. So he did mention that if you ate a barbecued sausage, you would test positive using his biomonitoring test, because this looks for the same chemical, which is
something to do with
which is already in a barbecued sausage.
Yeah. So
I did think this project
possibly not the most useful scalable test, really.
Yeah. If it's getting confused by a barbecued sausage, maybe there's some R&D work. If you notice in the last results, it was downgraded in the pipeline chart. So it now has a small potential value. It used to be medium, now it's small. And talking to Peter Harrison, I thought this is probably not worth pursuing any further in the AGM. So I think it's a 0 from me in terms of future shareholder value. And put it this way, I don't expect shareholders to become too excited about it over the next few years. I mean, it's good and bad. It's good and bad, really. So it's bad because it's not going to be of that much value to shareholders, but it's good because we can forget about it and talk about Alzheimer's, because that is a bit more exciting.
Yeah, from what I understand, the excitement around testing and treatment of Alzheimer's has really moved a step forwards. So there's now not just the hope of realistic treatment, but also people seem to be closer to a test and also to finding a commercial application for a test as well.
Yeah, Peter Harrison, he was excited about the Alzheimer's work being undertaken by Bioventix. So in his 10-minute opening remarks, the only product he mentioned was the tau protein project, which is testing for Alzheimer's. He didn't mention anything else. He mentioned the word exciting quite a few times, which seems positive. And if you look back through some of Bioventix's statements to the stock market, they very rarely use the word exciting. So if Peter Harrison is sitting there saying, oh, we are really excited about the future with this antibody, with this Alzheimer's testing, so you start to sit up and take a bit of notice. Just to go back to October's results. So the October results referred to the recent success of the ISA Biogen lecanemab clinical trial. So this is a treatment, at the time is a potential treatment for Alzheimer's. So it's not a cure, but a treatment to slow the onset of Alzheimer's. So at the time of the results, it was just the phase 3 trials had been announced, or the results of those trials have been announced. And just the other week, early January, it's been approved for use by the FDA in the States. So you now can have a treatment to slow down the onset of Alzheimer's in the States. So I think this is the first proper treatment. I think there've been other treatments before, but they've either not really worked or there's been doubts as if they worked at all. So this is seemingly the first proper treatment where if you take this treatment for 18 months, according to the trials, it will slow the onset of Alzheimer's by 27%, which is fantastic. So all of a sudden now, there's now a treatment on the market for Alzheimer's. So the healthcare industry is now saying, okay, how can we find people who are likely to develop Alzheimer's or in the very early stages of Alzheimer's so they can have this treatment?
Big incentive for a testing program because you're wanting to catch it as early as possible. Well,
exactly. So now there's a treatment. You'd like to think the treatments will get better over time. So this is the first treatment which is on the market. Looks like it can work, but the treatments are going to improve all the time. So the holy grail now for the healthcare industry is to have some sort of screening program where you can find people who are likely to develop Alzheimer's or who have already developing it in the very early stages. So at the moment, the tests are a brain scan, MRI scan, or a test for spinal fluid. You test your spinal fluid. So both those tests are not very practical for screening lots of people, but a blood test would be, because it's cheap, fast, simple. And if you can put it in your blood test in the machine, you can say, you're likely to develop Alzheimer's, or you're starting to already show the symptoms of Alzheimer's from your blood. That's the holy grail. So this is where Bioventix comes in with its tau protein testing. The blood test, it shows that, it suggests that you may be in the early stages of developing Alzheimer's. There was a good question in the AGM from somebody who, this was not me, somebody else who clearly knew something about antibodies. And he asked Peter Harrison about this upcoming publication or academic write-up of results of testing its antibody with the University of Gothenburg in a journal called Brain. He asked, what's this academic write-up publication going to say about your antibody being tested by the University of Gothenburg and the results? And he said he'd just have to wait for it to be published, really, with a smile. So it was published over Christmas, and it seems positive. It's 10 pages of densely packed text about results, medical results from this test. I'm not 100% sure I've got this right, but looking through it, it seems positive that they've developed an antibody which is comparable to the spinal fluid test in terms of detecting whether you're likely to develop Alzheimer's or not, or you're in the very early stages. So that seems positive. You're already on a par with a spinal fluid test. So there's more tests needs to be done with this antibody. So Bioventix developing the antibody, the researchers in this University at Gothenburg who are world-renowned researchers in Alzheimer's are testing it. And these researchers have tested it against the spinal fluid tests, which are an established benchmark. And the Bioventix antibodies testing for this tau protein have shown a similar sort of reading compared to the spinal fluid tests. So the more tests need to be done with this particular antibody. So you need more people, a wider range of people, and also testing same people over a longer time scale with different samples of their blood to make sure it definitely works. But the whole thing is quite positive.
Yeah, so it does sound very promising.
It does sound very promising. And Peter Harrison was genuinely, he said, I'm genuinely excited. I think that's what he said about Alzheimer's research and the possibility of future Alzheimer's antibodies as well. So it's not just this one, it's future ones as well, he said. So maybe there's more in the pipeline, who knows? But the vibe throughout the meeting about Alzheimer's was positive. Yeah, I'm positive as well.
And you're excited too, yeah. So what kind of timescale are we looking at? Obviously, I understand these things take quite a while to be developed and approved and so on.
Yeah, I asked this. So if it all goes well with tau, when will the money roll in from the royalties? And he said it's a 2030s thing. Peter Harrison, it's a 2030s thing. So if it all goes well, you're not going to see anything for at least 7 years, which is okay. It's going to take a few years to come off, and for some sort of reasonably large screening program from healthcare providers where the royalties will start mounting up, assuming they develop an antibody that actually works and somebody else doesn't get there first. That's the risk.
Yeah, I was going to say there are a lot of other people working on tau protein and antibodies as well.
There is a lot. So again, I asked this, who else is supplying antibodies to these researchers in Gothenburg? And they said, oh yeah, it's not just us. But there's also other labs around the world with leading experts in Alzheimer's testing. They're trying to develop simple blood tests for Alzheimer's. It's not just Bioventix here. And also now there's a treatment on the market. All of a sudden, that's going to kickstart a lot of other people getting interested as well. But having this publication in Brain, that should help Bioventix, because all of a sudden you've got the researchers, these world-leading researchers in Gothenburg saying that your antibody is working. That's going to generate interest, people get in contact with Bioventix to help them on similar sort of matters. And so a lot of people working on it, a lot of competition, but things seem to be moving. The thing is about Bioventix is that they've been working on this for a few years, well before the treatment was on the market. So if you are now thinking, oh, okay, there's now a treatment for Alzheimer's, I better start looking at an antibody for a simple blood test, but you're already a few years behind. So you'd like to think Bioventix has some sort of advantage there where they're ahead of anybody starting now, but who knows? And you've got to wait at least 7 years before any sort of mass or reasonably large screening process using these antibodies comes into operation.
Yeah, big potential, but not without some risk at the moment. So apart from tau, are there any other exciting future products in the pipeline, or is this really the big...
It's the big hope. From what I can tell from the AGM, it's the big hope. So biomonitoring, forget that. I think that's a zero for shareholders, effectively. Tau, that looks pretty good at the moment. And then the other thing on the pipeline chart are these two investments in Norwegian research groups. So one of them's looking at a antibody test for cardiac problems, and the other's looking for Alzheimer's research as well. So this is the Norwegian research group is testing for a protein called amyloid beta. So amyloid beta is a protein that builds up in the brain, causes Alzheimer's. It interferes with the tau protein. And so if you've got Alzheimer's, the hallmark of Alzheimer's is you've got a buildup of this protein called amyloid beta, the buildup of this other protein called tau. And Bioventix are testing for the tau, and this other Norwegian group is testing for amyloid beta. So I did ask Peter Harrison which one's more likely to work. He said the data for tau, which is funded entirely by Bioventix, is looking better than the amyloid beta testing. So if the amyloid beta testing works, becomes good, actually makes money, great for Bioventix, but they just have an investment in this group. So it's not, so it'll be a smaller amount. But if this tau works, so there'll be a much larger influence on the business because they funded the research for these antibodies all by themselves. So they'll just get 100% of the royalties rather than a fraction because they just invested in another group. So I'm hoping the tau works, but amyloid beta, I don't know. But effectively, in terms of growth, you can forget biomonitoring. It's all about tau, to be honest. That's the 2030s. You may get something from one of those Norwegian investments, but it's not going to be, I don't think it's going to be that significant, to be honest. In terms of new products, it's all resting on Alzheimer's. In growth, I think it's just the troponin plus the vitamin D tests, which are, they've said in the last results, between 8 to 10% growth, I think, something like that.
So that's not too bad, actually, for an established product. It should help to support just a trickle of growth for the profit and dividend every year, or just supporting the whole picture. But it does sound like really there's almost two halves to the story. If tau succeeds, then it's probably fair to say that the whole business could probably be worth a lot more in the future, say a decade from now. But without tau, then you're looking at still a valuable investment, but not to the same extent, and with a much greater risk of a gradual decline as well, really, because I suppose the long lead times on these new projects mean that even if something as good as tau came up, you're looking at way beyond the early 2030s probably, aren't you, before it would become a commercial reality. So I suppose this is, for me anyway, this is the main risk looking at this as an investment. There's the dependency on vitamin D, which is probably going to be a stable thing, but as you say, there could be more competition or pressure on pricing in the future. And then there's the uncertainty about whether Bioventix's tau antibody will be an eventual winner.
The vitamin D is 40% of the revenue, and it's been a big money spinner for years. But if somebody disrupts the vitamin D market, or something happens in the vitamin D market where either the doctors don't want to test for it anymore, or the blood test machine manufacturers introduce their own vitamin D, and they're fed up paying Bioventix to all these royalties, and they decide to introduce their own, or something else, or the hospitals generally don't want to pay as much. They're all risks which Bioventix can't do anything about. But at the moment, the history suggests it's a big money spinner and it's done well. But That's the risk, some sort of disruption. Yeah, and it's 40% of the sales. So if there is big trouble there, it may be gradual because the hospitals, they're on these 5, 10, 15-year contracts. So if they renew with a different antibody, I don't really know how this works, but if they're committed to using a Bioventix type antibody, it may be a while before they use something else. I don't know how it works, and I'm not even sure if Bioventix know how it works, given the visibility of it. We're a bit
like a gradual decline, but
yeah.
you
You'd
can't
like to
really
think it's a
flash.
we're shareholders. We always think it's going to be a gradual decline,
Yeah,
but who knows? But the
Yeah,
worry,
but at the end of the day, there's never no such thing as a perfect investment. There's always going to be some level of risk, isn't there? I suppose with this, it's the unknown future, the dependency on one or two key things rather than the financials, which have a big safety margin built into them already.
yeah, it's the lack of insight. I was surprised at the lack of insight they have, like that biotin product mentioned earlier. Who's buying? We know who's buying, but what for? Don't know. The worry is that something's happening in the vitamin D market and the royalties go down, and they think, why are the royalties going down? And they don't know. That's the impression I've got from the AGM. Maybe they were a little bit cagey at the AGM. I don't know, and they know a little bit more what's going on than they suggested. But the risk is vitamin D royalties are going down year on year, and they or start going down year on year, and they don't know why. And then we find out, oh, there's some sort of end user disruption in the hospitals, or they're using a different antibody, and they just don't know. And shareholders are slow to find out as well. So that's the risk, and the lack of sort of general insight into the industry, and the lack of being at the mercy of what arrangements are between the likes of Roche, Siemens, and Abbott with the hospitals, and what they decide what the hospitals decide they're going to pay, and whether that affects the amount Bioventix get. If they're going to pay less, Bioventix can't do anything. That 2% is 2% of something less, so the royalties decline. So are you a happy shareholder? After my AGM and explanation of antibodies, are you a happy shareholder or a slightly concerned one?
No, I'm still a pretty happy shareholder. I don't have quite as much history with the business as you, but I'm happy with what I've learned so far and what I've seen so far, and I feel the story from management is fairly consistent, and they don't seem overly optimistic or chasing too many false leads. So I'm quite happy with the story. I'm obviously very happy with the financial performance of the business and the way it generates cash. Yeah, I'm happy. I would probably consider buying more at the right price, although it would have to be a bit lower than the current price for me.
How do they look on a dividend basis then at £40?
Yeah, the shares have bounced back a bit since October. I think the price is about 20% higher than it was then. So there's not quite the same level of value on offer that there was a few months ago. I think looking at the forecast, the dividend yield for the current year is around 3.5%, rising to something like 3.8% in the next financial year. So from an income perspective, it's not an especially high yield, but it's probably worth saying that the payout is expected to continue rising by around 10% each year. So even in an inflationary environment like at the moment, shareholders are probably getting a real terms income increase. There's some value in that and that rate of dividend growth. In fact, I think the growth is worth bearing in mind because all else being equal, a company's share price is over long periods is likely to follow its dividend growth over the same period. And it's not a straight close relationship, but I think over time, that's a kind of valid approximation. You can look at the yield plus the growth rate and get a kind of idea of total return. So in this case, that's well over 10% a year expected over the next couple of years. That's quite attractive. But I suppose given the risks we've been discussing, I would probably want a bit more upfront yield from the shares really today. So for me, they're a little bit expensive to buy, but I'm certainly quite happy to continue holding them like this. Does that match up with your view on valuation?
Yeah, my valuation. I take a slightly different view. I do a sum of the parts because they have a troponin antibody, but the income from troponin, it stops in 2032 due to the licensing arrangement. So that has a finite life. So with some perhaps ambitious sales of troponin, just over 1 million last year, but I think over the next 10 years, perhaps that could be the total royalties could be 25 million, something like that. Could be very ambitious. And then looking at vitamin D and the other antibodies, which are on a perpetual royalty stream, you strip out the R&D, they can generate earnings of almost 8 million a year. So if you put that on a P of 25, which again may be a bit ambitious, but you get close to 200 million. So you add those two together, the troponin, the vitamin D, 200 million, you get something close to today's market cap, which suggests the pipeline, which is effectively Tau, which is costing £1 million a year in R&D, is all in for nothing, which sounds about right, given that any sort of income from it is going to be 2030 at the very earliest. Yeah, it's looking quite fair. The shares at £40, the shares first hit £40 almost 4 years ago. Yes, it's a high quality business, but there is a price where high quality business can be expensive, and the share price return could be disappointing. So that was the case 4 years ago. If anybody bought at £40, yes, you've had some dividends, but it's not been a fantastic return. But now, 4 years later, the company's grown its profits since then. The dividend's higher. Maybe it's a better time, or at least not as a better time than it was 4 years ago. I'm like you. I think there's maybe a better buying opportunity ahead, and the market perhaps has twigged onto some of this Alzheimer's development, and that's perhaps why it's gone back up to £40 in the last few months. One thing I'm struggling to think of is selling Bioventix. I can't really think of any reasons to sell, which is perhaps very dangerous. Can you think of any reasons to sell? What would have to happen if you decide to exit completely or just sell a few?
I suppose, like you, I can't think, there's no pressing reasons that I'd sell at the moment. And in general, I wouldn't sell just on valuation alone, unless the valuation had become so completely detached from reality that it made sense to think about getting some cash out and using it to increase the yield from my portfolio elsewhere. But I think really the only reason I'd seriously start to sell would be if I felt the story was breaking down. So either the pipeline was not living up to expectations and not being refilled at all, or else evidence that the existing antibodies were losing their competitive edge. So either through competition or pricing or changes to the volume, something that we can't really predict now, and perhaps the company can't predict either. But right now, no, I don't see any reason to sell. I certainly don't expect to in the near future. Is that how you view the situation?
Maybe I'm getting too keen on this, but on this Bioventix, just remembering before this podcast, for preparing this podcast, I looked at some of the old presentations done by Peter Harrison on PI World from 6 or 7 years ago, where he explained about the antibody model. Whereas once you've got one working, it tends not to be dislodged. And looking back at how old some of these antibodies are, it's just 20 years old. It's just fantastic. So I'm in danger of falling in love with this share. So I've got to stand back a little bit. But if the market price becomes bonkers based on some sort of hope with the Alzheimer's, then that might be a reason to trim. If it becomes too big a part of my portfolio, that might be a reason to trim. If Peter Harrison leaves, generally, I think if top-notch management leave a company, that's always creates a risk. Who's the next guy coming in? Are they going to be any good? I think it's going to change. But if Peter Harrison leaves, yes, the R&D will stop, but the royalties will still come in. This is the thing. If Peter Harrison leaves and everybody leaves, the royalties from these old antibodies will still be coming in all the time. You need the finance director to collect the royalties and pay the tax, but everyone else can leave. And yes, they won't have any R&D and they won't sell any physical product, but the royalties will still be coming in. And you still have some sort of business. And I think how many businesses can say that, where everybody apart from the finance director can leave and there'll still be a business there? Not many. That was probably giving the kiss of death to the stock, to the company. But I'm optimistic.
Yeah, it certainly is unusual to find a business that has that safety margin, that kind of cushion, that cash would keep rolling in for years, even without them doing anything at all.
This is the sort of business where even I could be in charge and I wouldn't do too much damage because the royalties would just come in.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously worth pointing out that if that did happen, the remaining value of the business would be substantially lower than it is now, probably because of the loss of the pipeline opportunity. But as you say, it would still have a very meaningful value and still continue to produce cash. It's going to be an interesting one to watch, I think, Maynard.
Well, that's it for this time. Thanks for listening to the Private Investors Podcast. If you enjoyed the podcast, please let us know by liking, subscribing, or even leaving a review. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.